My name is Margaret, and I will never forget the day I buried my husband. The church was filled with flowers, the air heavy with sorrow. But my sorrow was met with cruelty. As I sat in the front row, tears streaming down my face, I looked up to see my own children, laughing. Not tears of grief, but laughter at my pain. At that moment, my heart broke in more ways than one. I stayed silent. I bowed my head, swallowing the ache, and told myself, this is not the day for anger. They thought my silence meant weakness. They thought my tears meant defeat. But what they didn't know was that destiny was already writing its own ending. And a month later, as we gathered again, this time in the lawyer's office, the laughter would stop. And for the first time, I would be the one smiling. The morning of my husband's funeral was the coldest day of my life. Not just because of the weather, though the sky was gray and the air damp with a drizzle that soaked through my black dress, but because my heart felt frozen inside my chest. I remember staring at the mirror before leaving the house, my eyes red and swollen, my hands trembling as I pulled a simple black shawl across my shoulders. I had buried many dreams in my life, but that day, I was burying the man who had been my partner for over 30 years. As I walked into the church, the scent of lilies and roses filled the air. People whispered, offering condolences, but their words floated around me like echoes I could barely hear. My legs felt heavy, my spirit exhausted. I moved to the front pew, where I belonged, closest to his casket, closest to him for the very last time. I wanted to weep quietly, to honor him, to remember the man who once held my hand and promised I'd never be alone. But then, I felt it. That sharp sting, that piercing glance. My own children, his children, sitting a few rows behind me, their faces not softened by grief, but twisted with something else. Smirks, mocking smiles, whispers behind raised hands. Laughter, yes, actual laughter at my tears. At first I thought I was imagining it. My mind was fogged with grief after all. But as I dabbed my eyes with a tissue, I caught their eyes. My eldest daughter, her lips curled in a cruel grin, nudging her brother as though my pain were a joke. My son shook his head and whispered something that made the others chuckle under their breath. The sound didn't echo loudly in the church, but to me, it was deafening. There I was, saying goodbye to the man I loved, and instead of comfort, instead of unity, my children chose cruelty. They saw their mother vulnerable, and instead of reaching for my hand, they pulled it away with mockery. My heart broke in that very moment, not only for losing my husband, but for realizing the truth I had tried to ignore for so long. My children had hardened into something unrecognizable. They weren't mourning their father. They were reveling in my weakness. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up in that holy place and shout, "How dare you!" But instead, I swallowed my pain. I kept my head high, my shoulders steady, and I stayed silent. Because dignity, I told myself, was all I had left. My tears fell, yes, but I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. The service went on, the priest speaking words of comfort, the choir singing hymns that once would have filled me with peace. But all I could hear was the faint sound of laughter, the occasional snicker, the shuffle of feet as my children leaned toward one another to exchange cruel whispers. I could feel their eyes on me, judging, mocking, as though I were a stranger, not their mother. When it came time to walk past the casket, to lay my trembling hand upon the polished wood one last time, I steadied myself. I looked down at his face, so still, so cold, yet so peaceful, and I whispered, "I will carry your strength, even now." But as I turned back toward the pews, I caught sight of my children once more. My son rolled his eyes, my daughter smirked as if to say, "You're pathetic." That betrayal cut deeper than any knife could. To lose a husband is unbearable enough. But to realize that the very children I carried, the children I raised, could laugh at my grief, it tore something inside me that may never fully heal. The burial was no better. As we stood at the graveside, the drizzle turning into rain, I clutched my umbrella and tried to keep my footing on the muddy ground. The priest spoke of ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I felt the earth close in around me as the casket was lowered, each thud of the ropes against the wood echoing in my chest. I glanced sideways, and there again, those whispers, those smirks. My children huddled together beneath a shared umbrella, not even pretending to cry, their shoulders shaking with muffled laughter. I wanted to believe it was the absurdity of grief, that maybe they were nervous, uncomfortable. But no, their eyes met mine with a coldness I cannot describe, as though I were an outsider in their circle, as though my pain were entertainment. When the final handfuls of dirt were thrown, I lingered. I placed a single rose upon his grave and whispered, "Rest now, my love. I'll be stronger than they think." Behind me, I heard my children sigh impatiently, one of them even chuckling. Finally, under their breath, as if burying their father was a chore to check off a list. I said nothing. I turned, my back straight, my chin lifted, though my heart felt as though it were shattering into pieces with every step. My shoes sank into the wet earth as I walked away, but I refused to stumble. People later told me they admired my composure, that I seemed dignified and strong despite my grief. What they didn't know was that every smile from my children that day had been like a dagger, every whisper like poison. And yet, I endured. I endured because I knew that life has a way of revealing truth in its own time. I endured because my husband always said, "Silence, Margaret, is sometimes the loudest answer." And I endured because deep inside me, even in my darkest hour, I knew. This was not the end of the story. As we drove away from the cemetery, raindrops sliding down the window like tears, I glanced once more at the umbrella under which my children stood, their laughter faint but cruel. I clenched my fists in my lap and thought, one day, the laughter will stop. One day, you'll see what your cruelty has cost you. That day, I buried my husband, but I also buried something else. The last thread of innocence I held for my children. I had seen their true faces, and I could never unsee them. Still, I stayed silent. I bowed my head, and I let destiny begin its work. Asterisk. When I returned home from the funeral, the house felt like a tomb. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort you but presses against your chest until you can hardly breathe. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than ever, each second mocking me with its reminder that time moves on, even when your heart refuses to. I walked into the living room, and everywhere I looked, there was a memory. His armchair still sat angled toward the fireplace, as if he had only just risen to make a cup of tea. His reading glasses rested neatly on the side table, balanced on top of the newspaper he had been reading the week before he passed. His jacket still hung on the coat rack near the door. The scent of his cologne lingered faintly in the air, clinging to the walls, to the fabric of the curtains, to my very soul. I sank into his chair, the leather still warm in my memory of him, and for the first time since the service, I allowed myself to sob freely. The tears came in waves, violent and unstoppable, as I clutched his glasses to my chest and whispered, "Why did you leave me?" But even as I cried, I heard his voice echoing in my mind, the words he had spoken to me so many times during our marriage. "Margaret, if anything ever happens to me, you will never be unprotected. I promise you that." He used to say it lightly, almost jokingly whenever I worried about bills, about our children, about the future. He would pat my hand and assure me, "You'll always be taken care of. I'll make sure of it." At the time, I never truly believed those words. They sounded like the kind of empty promises husbands make to calm their wives. But now, sitting alone in that house, I clung to them like a lifeline. "You'll never be unprotected." He had said it with such conviction. And deep down, I began to wonder, did he know? Did he see this betrayal coming? Did he prepare for it? The days after the funeral were some of the loneliest of my life. The house, once filled with laughter and conversation, became a hollow shell. I would wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for him only to find his side of the bed cold and empty. Meals went uneaten because cooking for one felt like torture. I would pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit, only to stare at the second cup until it went cold, untouched. But even in my grief, I noticed something. My children, those same children who laughed at my tears, did not call, did not check in, did not stop by to see if I was managing. It was as if I had buried them too. Their absence hurt, yes, but it also freed me from pretending. I no longer had to shield myself from their cruel smiles. The silence of the house, while painful, was easier to bear than the sound of their mockery. So I began to talk to him. Not out loud, not always, but in whispers, in thoughts, in prayers. I would sit in his chair and tell him about my day. I would stand in the garden we planted together and ask him if the roses looked as beautiful as the ones we grew in our first home. I would hold his wedding band, now resting on a chain around my neck, and promise him that I would endure. Little by little, something inside me shifted. Grief still lived in me, yes, but beneath it, a quiet strength began to stir. It was not loud, not the kind of strength that announces itself with bold gestures. No, it was quiet, patient, steady, like a river carving through stone. I began to take long walks through the neighborhood, just as we used to. I listened to the birds sing, to the wind moving through the trees. I breathed deeply, reminding myself that I was still here, still alive. I started writing in a journal, pouring out my anger, my sorrow, my memories. And in those pages, I discovered not only the weight of my loss, but the power of my resilience. And always, in the back of my mind, was his promise: you will never be unprotected. Sometimes late at night, I would sit by the fire with his old letters spread out across my lap. Letters he wrote to me when we were young, when love was fresh and the world seemed endless. In one of them, written during a time when he had been traveling for work, he wrote, "If the world ever turns against you, remember, I am always with you even if you can't see me. My love is your shield." Those words felt prophetic now, because the world had turned against me. My own flesh and blood had betrayed me. But his love, it was still here, wrapped around me like armor. Each day I rose a little taller. Each night I cried a little less. I began to realize that silence was not weakness. It was strength. It was patience. It was waiting for the right moment to speak, the right moment to act. I thought often about the will, about the lawyer, about the papers my husband had signed in confidence. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew my husband. I knew the careful way he planned, the way he protected me in life. And I knew with every fiber of my being that he had left something behind. Not just love, not just memories, but a plan, a final act of devotion. So I waited. I kept my dignity. I lived each day quietly, tending to the house, visiting his grave, speaking to him in whispers no one else could hear. And though my children might have thought they had broken me, they were wrong. For in my silence, I was rebuilding. In my grief, I was gathering strength. And in my waiting, I was preparing for the day when the truth would finally come to light. The day when their laughter would die in their throats. And I would be the one smiling. Asterisk. The day of the will reading arrived like a storm cloud I had been watching on the horizon. I knew it was coming, but I didn't know just how fierce it would be. The lawyer had called me 2 weeks after the funeral, asking me to come to his office. He said my husband's estate needed to be settled, and the family gathered. His tone was formal, professional, but I could sense something beneath it, almost a weight in his voice. When the day came, I dressed simply. A black dress, modest, with a pearl necklace my husband had given me on our 20th anniversary. I wasn't there to impress anyone, and I certainly wasn't there to fight. I was there to honor him, to hear his last words, to accept whatever he had decided. My hands trembled as I buttoned my coat, but my heart felt strangely steady. The lawyer's office was on the top floor of a tall brick building downtown. I remember the elevator ride, slow and creaking, carrying me upward as if it were carrying me into another chapter of my life. When the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway lined with bookshelves and old portraits. The air smelled faintly of leather and ink. And there they were, my children, sitting in the waiting area, dressed in designer clothes, looking as though they were headed to a business meeting rather than the reading of their father's will. Their faces were smug, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. They didn't greet me with hugs, not even with polite words. Instead, my eldest son smirked and said, "Well, Mother, I suppose today we find out how much dear father really left us." His words stung, not because of what he said, but because of the tone. Entitled, dismissive, as though I were nothing more than an afterthought in my husband's life. My daughters whispered to one another, chuckling under their breath, shooting me glances that dripped with arrogance. They were so certain that their father's years of hard work, his fortune, his property, his legacy, would all be theirs to split like wolves tearing into a carcass. The lawyer stepped out of his office, a tall man with kind eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses. He shook my hand gently, as though he could sense the heaviness in my heart. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, "thank you for coming. If you'll all follow me, we can begin." We entered a large room lined with mahogany shelves, the walls heavy with leather-bound volumes. At the center was a long polished table. Papers were neatly stacked at one end, and a crystal pitcher of water gleamed beneath the light. The air was tense, charged, as though the very room understood the weight of what was about to unfold. I sat quietly near the lawyer, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes lowered. My children took their seats opposite me, their laughter fading into smug silence. My eldest daughter leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as though this were all a mere formality. The lawyer cleared his throat. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Mr. Charles Whitmore." His voice was calm, measured, but the room seemed to hold its breath. He unfolded the document, adjusted his glasses, and began. "I, Charles Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament." The words struck me like a ghost's whisper. My husband's voice seemed to echo through the lawyer's tone, steady, deliberate, filled with love I could feel even now. "I leave to my beloved wife, Margaret Whitmore." The lawyer paused, glancing at me with the faintest smile before continuing, "the entirety of my estate. All assets, properties, accounts, investments, and holdings are to be placed in her sole care and ownership." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable silence. For one brief, breathtaking moment, the room was utterly silent. My children's faces, once smug, twisted into masks of shock and disbelief. My eldest son's jaw dropped, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the arms of his chair. My daughters exchanged frantic glances, their whispers now choked and sharp. "That's impossible," my son finally barked, his voice breaking the silence. "He wouldn't. He couldn't leave everything to her." But the lawyer remained calm, his eyes steady. "Mr. Whitmore's instructions are perfectly clear. Everything passes to his wife, Margaret." My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to cry, not from greed or triumph, but from the overwhelming flood of emotion. My husband's words, his promise, came rushing back. "You'll never be unprotected." He had kept his word. Even from beyond the grave, he had wrapped his love around me like a shield. My children erupted in chaos. My eldest daughter stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is outrageous. We're his children. We're his blood," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. My younger son slammed his fist against the table, his face red with anger. "You must be mistaken." He spat at the lawyer. "Read it again. There has to be something for us." But the lawyer shook his head. There is no mistake. Mr. Whitmore was very deliberate in his wishes. Everything goes to his wife. His words are final. I sat there, silent. My hands trembled in my lap, but my face remained composed. I didn't gloat, I didn't smirk. I simply sat, with dignity, as my children's anger filled the room. Inside, however, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and vindication. My husband had seen their true natures just as I had, and with his final act, he had chosen to protect me, not them. "This is her doing," my eldest son roared, pointing a finger at me. "She manipulated him. She turned him against us." His accusations burned, but I did not rise to them. I knew the truth, and so did my husband. The lawyer cleared his throat again, his voice cutting through the chaos. Mr. Whitmore anticipated this reaction. He asked me to include a letter with his will, a personal message. He unfolded a single sheet of paper, his hands careful, reverent. As he read, my husband's voice seemed to fill the room once more. "To my children, you are the heirs of my name, but not of my labor. Over the years I have watched your hearts harden, your respect for your mother diminish. I cannot, in good conscience, reward cruelty with wealth. The greatest legacy I leave you is not money, but the chance to change your ways. If you choose love, kindness, and respect, you will find more wealth than I could ever give. Until then, everything I have goes to your mother, who stood by me in love, in sacrifice, and in loyalty all the days of my life." The words struck the room like thunder. My children fell silent, their anger swallowed by shock. I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my cheeks, not from pain this time, but from love, pure, enduring love. My husband had seen me. He had honored me. He had given me not only security, but also justice. When I opened my eyes, I saw their faces, pale, stunned, broken by the weight of truth. And for the first time since that dreadful day at the funeral, I felt something shift inside me. Strength. Quiet, unshakable strength. I didn't need to say a word. My silence was enough. My husband had spoken for me. And in that silence, as the echoes of his letter faded, I realized something. Their laughter was gone. And I was the one smiling inside. Asterisk. The room erupted after the lawyer finished reading my husband's letter. My children, who moments before had been smug and confident, now looked like cornered animals. Rage and disbelief poured out of them in waves, shattering the solemn air of the office. My eldest son was the first to stand, slamming his hand against the polished mahogany table so hard that the water glasses rattled. "This is a trick," he shouted, his face red with fury. "There's no way Father would leave everything to her." He jabbed his finger toward me as though I were some kind of enemy sitting across the battlefield. My eldest daughter followed, her voice shrill and shaking. "He was old. He was sick. She probably made him change the will when he wasn't in his right mind. This isn't fair, and it isn't legal." The younger two joined in, overlapping one another with accusations, their voices like daggers piercing the air. "She manipulated him. This isn't real. We'll fight this in court." Their words spun around me in a storm, cruel and cutting, but I sat still. I folded my hands in my lap, my face calm, my shoulders straight. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. Because I didn't need to. The lawyer, who had remained composed through their shouting, finally raised his voice, not loud but firm enough to cut through the chaos. "That's enough," he said, his tone sharp with authority. The room fell into a heavy, tense silence. He looked at each of my children in turn before continuing. "Your father's will is legal. It was signed, witnessed, and notarized in full accordance with the law. I sat with him personally as he outlined his wishes. He was of sound mind, clear in his intentions, and unwavering in his decisions. There is no ambiguity here, no loophole to exploit, No grounds for challenge. This will is final." The words struck like a hammer. My children's mouths fell open, but no sound came out for a moment. The weight of the lawyer's certainty seemed to press down on them, suffocating their protests. My eldest daughter was the first to recover. She scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Final? No. No, this can't be. He wouldn't do this to us. We're his children, his blood. How could he just leave us with nothing?" Her voice cracked on the last word, a mix of rage and desperation. The lawyer's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "He left you something far more valuable than money. He left you his words, and in them he made it clear that he hoped you would change your ways. But in terms of material inheritance, yes, everything goes to your mother." My eldest son sneered, his fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't over," he growled. "We'll contest it. We'll drag this into court if we have to. She can't just take everything." But the lawyer shook his head, calm and unshaken. "You are welcome to try, but I can assure you the will has been written and protected in such a way that a contest will fail. Your father was deliberate. He anticipated resistance, and he took every measure to ensure his wishes would be honored." As his words echoed through the room, I felt something stir inside me, something powerful and unexpected. For the first time since the funeral, I felt my husband's presence as if he were sitting beside me. Not in body, but in spirit. Strong, protective, resolute. It was as if he were whispering, "I told you, Margaret, you'll never be unprotected." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. Not out of weakness this time, but out of overwhelming gratitude. Gratitude that even in death he had shielded me. Gratitude that his love had carried me through betrayal and was now delivering justice. My children continued to protest, their voices rising again in a chorus of anger and disbelief. "This is ridiculous. It's not fair. You'll regret this, Mother." But I did not speak. I did not argue. My silence was my weapon. My composure was my shield. Their rage only made my stillness more powerful. Every insult they hurled, every accusation they spat, it all fell into the void, powerless against the strength my husband had given me. The lawyer eventually stood, gathering his papers with a deliberate calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos across the table. "I will not sit here and listen to baseless accusations against your mother," he said firmly. "Your father made his decision, and it was out of love for her. You may be angry, but anger does not change the truth." He looked toward me then, his expression softening. "Mrs. Whitmore, you are the sole beneficiary. Everything now belongs to you, as your husband wished. If you'd like, we can arrange a private meeting to go over the details away from unnecessary conflict." I nodded once, my voice quiet but steady. "Thank you." I stood, smoothing the fabric of my dress with trembling hands. My children glared at me with eyes full of fire and betrayal, but I refused to meet their gaze. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing pain or anger in me. Instead, I lifted my chin, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the door. Behind me, their protests grew louder, but the sound no longer pierced me. It rolled off my back like rain against a window, because in that moment, I realized something profound. I was free. Free from their judgment, free from their mockery, free from the fear that I would be left unprotected. As I stepped into the hallway, the air outside the office felt lighter, easier to breathe. I paused for a moment, resting my hand on the wall, and whispered softly, "Thank you, Charles. You kept your promise." For the first time since his passing, I smiled. Not a smile of triumph, not a smile of revenge, but a smile of quiet justice. My silence had spoken louder than their anger. My dignity had outlasted their cruelty. And in that silence, I could feel him beside me, strong and steady, just as he always had been. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was standing tall, carried not by my own strength alone, but by his love. The love that even death could not silence. Asterisk. The days after the will reading were quiet, almost eerily so. The office visits ended, the shouting stopped, and my children seemed to retreat into themselves, simmering with anger and disbelief. But I did not move hastily. I did not call them. I did not confront them. I stayed quiet, observing, planning, living. With full control of the estate, I began to take steps that were deliberate, steady, and calculated, but never cruel. I reviewed the properties, the accounts, the investments my husband had meticulously arranged. Every asset, every detail, every plan he had put in place to secure my future now rested entirely in my hands. I did not need to make any rash decisions, for I had time, patience, and the guidance of his carefully constructed legacy. The house we had shared, our sanctuary, our memories, became my refuge. I moved through it methodically, tending to the garden, arranging the rooms, restoring order to a space that had felt empty for so long. Every decision I made was rooted not in spite, but in wisdom. I paid off debts, ensured staff were cared for, and made sure that the foundations my husband had built were not just preserved, but strengthened. And slowly, word of my control spread. My children, who once viewed me as powerless, began to realize the extent of what they had lost. Their arrogance turned to anxiety as they saw me walking through the estate with confidence, making decisions, signing papers, and handling matters they had never truly understood. One morning, my eldest daughter appeared at the gate. She hesitated, clutching her designer handbag like it was armor. Her eyes darted to me, unsure whether I was angry, amused, or indifferent. "Mother, I don't know what to do," she stammered. I need help with the accounts, the bills, everything." I studied her silently. I did not rush to speak. I let the weight of her words sink in. I remembered her laughter at my tears, her smirks at my grief. I remembered the coldness, the cruelty, the betrayals that had once seemed insurmountable. Finally, I said calmly, almost softly, "The estate is in order. I have made all necessary arrangements. You can manage your own affairs now or seek assistance as you see fit. But remember, Mother's grace is not obligation." Her eyes widened. A flash of guilt, or was it fear, passed over her face. She said nothing further and left, her steps hurried, uncertain. Over the next few weeks, the others came. My son arrived next, his anger barely contained but tinged with desperation. "Mother, please, the taxes, the properties. I don't understand this paperwork. I need your guidance." Again, I remained composed. I offered explanations, guidance where necessary, but I never allowed their desperation to make me lose my calm. I never berated them, never punished them beyond the natural consequences of their own choices. They had chosen arrogance over respect, greed over love. Now they had to live with that. And live they did, awkwardly, resentfully, slowly learning humility. I did not speak of the funeral, did not remind them of the laughter, did not relish their discomfort. That would have been petty. Instead, I focused on my life, my peace, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing justice had already been served. I traveled, something I had long postponed. I restored the little cottage my husband and I had once dreamed about, spending mornings in the garden and evenings watching the sunset over the lake. I took long walks, visited friends I had neglected, and discovered joy in the things that truly mattered. With every decision I made, every peaceful moment I reclaimed, I felt a quiet strength grow within me. My husband had always told me, "Margaret, revenge is not in anger, it is in living well." I had not understood fully until now. Living well with dignity was the ultimate revenge. The estate continued to flourish under my careful management. Investments grew, properties appreciated, And I even initiated charitable contributions in my husband's name, decisions that he would have approved of, decisions that honored both of us. My children, meanwhile, were forced to confront the consequences of their own greed and cruelty. Where once they had demanded and expected, now they had to adapt, learn, and face realities they had ignored. Their arrogance had been replaced with caution, their entitlement with unease. Occasionally, I would hear whispers among neighbors, friends, and acquaintances about how well I had managed things, how composed I had remained under pressure, how dignified and wise I was despite betrayal. I never boasted, I never sought to gloat. But inside, I smiled. Not maliciously, not vindictively, but because I knew the truth. I had endured. I had honored my husband. I had been patient, and the universe, guided by his foresight, had delivered justice in the quietest, most perfect way. One day I found myself alone in the library, dusting the shelves my husband had so carefully arranged over the years. I paused, letting my hand brush across the spines of books we had both loved. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me, for protecting me, for teaching me the power of silence." The house was quiet, peaceful, secure. The estate was thriving, and I was finally free. Not from grief, for grief would always be a part of me, but from fear, from cruelty, and from the shadow of betrayal. For the first time, I felt fully myself, fully empowered, fully alive. My revenge had not been loud, it had not been cruel, it had not been immediate. It had been patient, deliberate, and most importantly, it had been mine. Living well on my own terms had silenced the past. My children would come to understand one day, not through my words, but through the consequences of their choices, that cruelty and greed never triumph over patience, dignity, and love. And so I continued, quietly, steadily, gracefully, knowing that the greatest revenge I could ever achieve was not punishment. It was life. A life full of peace, prosperity, and joy, lived exactly as I chose, shielded by the love and foresight of the man who had always protected me. Even now, as I sit in the sun-drenched garden, I can feel him near, smiling at the justice he left behind. And I smile too, not because they suffered, but because I thrived. Because I honored my marriage, my grief, and my own resilience. And in that, I found the ultimate revenge, living well, fully and freely, on my own terms. Asterisk. As I sit here now, reflecting on all that has passed, I realize that the deepest betrayals often come from those we love most. Family, whom we trust implicitly, can wound us in ways no stranger ever could. That day at the funeral, when my own children laughed at my tears, I thought I had lost everything. But life has a way of revealing the truth, and sometimes justice arrives quietly, without noise, without anger. My husband's will was more than just money or property. It was his final act of love. It was his way of standing beside me one last time, protecting me when I needed him most, and teaching me that patience and dignity are stronger than rage. In the weeks and months that followed, I discovered a strength I never knew I had. I learned that silence can be louder than shouting, that calmness can be more powerful than fury, and that patience often carries the loudest message of all. So I leave you with this. Sometimes the best revenge is not in confrontation or retaliation. Sometimes it is simply in living well, fully and freely, and letting life itself deliver the justice that words cannot. Asterisk.